my name's Jim. I've been working on Toyotas for 30 years. I made this movie to show you that the vast majority of the time, the only problem with your Toyota starter motor is dirty or burned electrical contacts. I buy these at the local Napa, and these contacts cost me less than $7, and I've repaired many starters this way. It's unusual for other problems to be internal on these starters. If your problem you have with your Toyota is that when you're going to start the engine, it is clicking, and several attempts at turning the key, finally the starter engages and starts the engine. If when the starter is working, if it sounds normal, if it's cranking the engine at the normal speed, then chances are it's only dirty contacts, and that's why you're repeatedly turning the key to try and get it to make that connection. In this video, I will show you how to clean these contacts in case of a necessary emergency, but it's best always to change them. And you will need some basic metric tools. If you can't take a starter out and work on it on the workbench, then probably you shouldn't be doing this. But the first thing you do is you take off the connection nut on the power side where the electrical power goes from the solenoid down into the motor itself, and you'll see that there is a rubber dust boot, and then you take off the big nut. Then remove this cover. It's a nut driver. It's either 7 or 8 millimeter size. And when you take off this cover, the 3 bolts, you'll find behind it there is a gasket. Don't lose track of the gasket and be careful not to break it. It's made out of rubber. On an older starter, that gasket can be very hard and brittle, so kind of be careful when you're taking loose this cover right here. It's not a big deal. There's lock washers on those bolts. Make sure you put those back on there. Those 3 holes there, and that cover comes off, and then you'll see clearly that there is that gasket. You can see there. And on this starter it is rubber, and it's still good. It's nice and flexible. Keep those parts together on your workbench. This is the solenoid drive, and it's an electromagnetic device. There's a spring on the end. Don't lose track of it. And it has a little contact ring around the surface of it, and then you can see clearly the 2 copper contacts here. There's variations on these. They are different left to right, and usually the Napa stocks all of them. Now see here the corrosion on this ring here. On this repair, I'm just going to use sandpaper and give this starter some more life, possibly years more life, just by cleaning the electrical deposits and cleaning up this surface with some 80 grit sandpaper. And it's not going to be perfect, but this starter will work correctly when I put it back together. Actually, this starter here doesn't have a problem. It's just a typical one. It has about 100,000 miles on it. It's beginning to show some wear. So taking off the nuts that are holding the posts on that retain these copper contacts, be certain that you keep the parts in order as you take them out. And then when you carefully remove these bolts, you will see in there is a rubber or plastic insulation washer. Remember exactly how that goes in place. And then on this side there is a contact cable coming from the inside of the starter motor, and then the bolt comes out, and then you can remove the copper contact, and it has, as I show there, some corrosion, and I'm just using 80 grit sandpaper here to clean it, and in no time I have it nice and shiny and smooth. On the other side, the contact is a little longer, and it has a little bit of a different configuration. I'm showing one here. This is actually an opposite from the one in this particular starter. As I said, there are variations. So be certain that you put the 2 contacts back in their location. On this side here, we're taking loose again this nut. This is a 14 millimeter nut. And when we remove it, there is a washer underneath, and then the small plastic insulator piece, which has a location pin that falls into a hole on the side of the starter motor. Just pay close attention to these when you take these pieces apart, and lay them out in order on your workbench so you don't lose track. On this bolt or stud, when you remove it, you will see there is an O-ring on the bolt right there. And then it has the plastic insulation sleeve and then the contact. And here I'm showing again that there's a new one versus a used one. And I'm going to also clean this one with the sandpaper. When reassembling, be certain that you put the parts in as they came out and on the correct side. What is important is that these contacts lay perfectly flat, because when you tighten that nut, it's possible that it may turn that contact a little bit. So using one finger to hold the contact in position, as I'm doing here, you put the parts back on, put on the washer and the nut, and tighten everything back up. And don't over tighten these parts, because these nuts seat down onto some plastic pieces. You don't have to get heavy handed here. Just snug this stuff up, and again, being certain that you have the contact laying perfectly flat across that surface right there. As you rotate that nut, hold it with your finger to keep it flat. There, it's that simple. Then we reassemble the other side. Again, remembering the way our components went together. And we have the plastic insulation sleeve, which is going to go in there. That keeps these pieces from coming in contact with the metal housing of the starter itself. That's the only way these parts don't short out, so it's important that this be assembled carefully. And again, we're going to make sure that that copper piece is perfectly flat laying down inside there. Then we put on our other components, the plastic sleeve, the washer, and the nut, and we tighten it carefully so that we do not over tighten it and fracture the plastic parts. Again, being certain that's flat down in there, the contact. Then we attach the power cable to the starter motor with our nut, which has a built-in lock washer. This nut here is 12 millimeter size. And again, it's not necessary to over tighten this. Just snug it up real nice. And then be sure that you have the rubber dust boot correctly seated over the plastic seat piece. And then reinstall your solenoid drive, being certain that you have it in the correct position and that the spring is going down into that small hole there in the center. Push it up and down to be certain that it's correctly installed. Put your cover back on with your 3 cover bolts and lightly tighten those snug. And your starter should be ready to go again for many more miles. If you put in new contacts, you may not ever need to work on the starter again. The typical failure time on these starters is around 100,000 miles, but it depends on how often you start the engine. If your car is a city car, you may have the starter problems much earlier. The only reason I made this video is because you can fix your starter for 10 bucks instead of buying one and paying somebody to put it in, which can cost hundreds of dollars. Thank you for watching.